Hello, my name is Cassia, and for as long as my memory reaches, my family made sure I understood one simple truth. I never truly belonged. It wasn't only the lies, the manipulation, or the obvious favoritism. It was in the little things too. The way my father looked at me like I was an inconvenience. The way my sister's smile widened every time she managed to twist a situation so that I took the blame. And the way my mother tried to shield me, but never strongly enough to truly stop what was happening. And then eventually, everything unraveled in a single moment. My sister set me up, and my father didn't even pause to question it. He threw me out of the house as if I were nothing more than a problem he was glad to be rid of. And as I walked away, she laughed behind me, saying the words I will never forget. "Good luck, loser." I was left with nothing. No place to stay, no safety, no family to turn to. But what they didn't realize was that within only a few days, everything would begin to change. Because karma has a strange way of finding its way back to the people who deserve it most. What happens when the people who betray you are finally forced to face the consequences? When the mother who once stayed quiet finally decides she has had enough and chooses to stand up and fight. The house on Meadowbrook Lane had always looked warm and welcoming from the outside. A classic two-story home painted a calm shade of blue with white shutters framing every window and a perfectly trimmed lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. It was the kind of house neighbors admired from the sidewalk, the kind that suggested love, laughter, and comfort lived inside those walls. But for me, it had never truly felt like home. I stepped out of my car, holding tightly onto the handle of my suitcase. The pressure in my grip a silent reflection of the tension that had settled deep inside my chest, the moment my eyes lifted toward the front door. Years of memories seemed to settle over my shoulders like a heavy weight. I had spent a long time convincing myself that returning here wouldn't affect me anymore, that I had grown past the uneasy feeling that always crept along my spine whenever I stood on this porch. But the truth was, it had never changed. Not really. I drew in a slow, steady breath before finally pushing the door open and stepping inside. The scent of lavender mixed with polished wood filled the hallway, a smell I recognized instantly, comforting and suffocating at the same time. My mother, Serafina, stood in the kitchen, quietly humming while she prepared dinner. The gentle sound of her voice filled the room. She turned the moment she heard the door open, and relief immediately brightened her face. "Cassia, sweetheart, you're here," she said, stepping forward and wrapping me in a warm embrace. It was the only kind of comfort I had ever truly felt in this house. But before I could even settle into that brief moment of safety, another voice drifted across the room, light, playful, and laced with a carefully crafted note of mock surprise. Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence. Ophelia. I turned slowly to see her in the living room, perched casually on the armrest of the couch like someone surveying a kingdom that belonged entirely to her. She had always been beautiful, effortlessly charming, the kind of woman who could draw attention the moment she walked into a room, and she knew exactly how much power that gave her. "Still dressing like some corporate office drone, I see," she said, her eyes gliding over my navy blazer and pressed slacks with thinly disguised amusement. I ignored her comment and set my suitcase beside the staircase. "Where's Dad?" I asked. But before the words had fully left my mouth, his voice echoed from the direction of the study. "Cassia." Magnus Calloway stepped into view, his presence as commanding as it had always been. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone carved him out of solid stone. His sharp features softened only when he looked at Ophelia. He barely spared me a glance before motioning toward the dining table. "Sit, we need to talk." A quiet knot of dread tightened inside my stomach, but I obeyed, because obedience had been something I learned early in life. Ophelia followed behind us, her smirk already forming as she slipped into the chair across from me, resting her chin against her palm like someone settling in to watch an entertaining show. Then, with an exaggerated pout, she said, "Cassia broke my laptop." For a moment, I simply blinked in confusion. "What? My MacBook?" She tilted her head. "The one Dad bought me last month?" "I discovered it cracked this morning." A sharp breath left my lungs as frustration rushed through me. "I didn't touch your laptop, Ophelia." But she had already turned her attention back to Magnus, her voice coded in carefully practiced disappointment. "She was in my room last night. Maybe she knocked it over without realizing. Magnus didn't hesitate. His gaze locked onto me, cold and unreadable. Is that true? Anger flared in my chest, the same anger I had swallowed again and again my entire life. No, it's not. I wasn't anywhere near her room. Serafina stepped forward, worry clear on her face. Magnus, you can't just assume. I don't assume, he interrupted sharply. I know when someone refuses to take responsibility for their actions. His eyes drilled into mine, as if daring me to contradict him. You need to be more careful, Cassia. If you can't respect other people's belongings, then you'll deal with the consequences. My hands curled into fists beneath the table. And what consequences are those? He leaned back, folding his arms calmly. No more access to the family accounts. You'll support yourself from now on. Disbelief slammed into me like a physical force. You can't be serious. Ophelia gave a small, satisfied shrug while Magnus nodded firmly. Oh, I'm very serious. Maybe this will finally teach you accountability. The unfairness of it made my pulse thunder in my ears, but I had been through this countless times before, fighting battles that were already decided long before I entered the room. There was no winning here. I pushed my chair back and stood. Fine. Without another word, I turned and walked outside, not stopping until I reached the backyard, where the cold evening air cooled the heat burning beneath my skin. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths, trying to push my emotions back into the quiet place where I kept them contained. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me back to reality. I expected a message from my assistant at work, but the name on the screen was my boss. I hesitated before answering. Hello? His tone was sharp. I just finished a meeting with the partners. The email with the quarterly reports never went out. A cold wave of dread spread through my chest. That's not possible. I sent it last night. No, you didn't. His voice held clear disappointment. You're being considered for a promotion, Cassia. Mistakes like this don't look good. I stopped speaking as realization struck like lightning. Ophelia. I had asked her to forward the email while I was tied up on a call with a client. She had smiled sweetly and promised she would. And now, my boss continued, I'll try to smooth things over, but don't let it happen again. The line went dead and I stood there, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. She had done it deliberately, and deep down I knew she wasn't finished yet. Later that evening, several of my colleagues came by for a small gathering, something I had arranged weeks earlier, hoping it would help strengthen my connections with the partners before they made their final decision about the promotion. But the moment we sat down, Magnus decided it was the perfect opportunity to humiliate me. She's always been a bit scatterbrained, he said casually, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Bright, sure, but never quite as sharp as she thinks. Ophelia laughed softly beside him, clearly entertained. I felt my throat tightened as my coworkers exchanged uncomfortable glances. I wanted to defend myself, to push back, but the words refused to come out. This was how things always happened. No matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, they only saw me as the girl who was never good enough. I excused myself early, my appetite gone, and later that night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, finally accepting a truth I had avoided for years. Nothing here would ever change. The following morning, the sunlight filtering through the blinds felt harsh against my tired eyes. My body felt heavy after a sleepless night, replaying every humiliating moment. My phone vibrated on the nightstand, and my heart clenched when I saw my boss's name again. A voicemail. I sat up slowly and pressed play. Cassia, I hate doing this over the phone, but the partners have made their decision. Considering the email issue and the missed deadline, they've decided to promote someone else. It isn't personal. You're still valuable to the team, but we need someone more reliable under pressure. The rest of his message blurred together. The promotion I had sacrificed so much for was gone, all because of a single email that had never been sent. Anger burned through me as I stormed into the kitchen where Ophelia sat calmly sipping coffee. She looked up lazily as I approached, a smirk already forming. You knew, I said, my voice shaking slightly. She blinked innocently. Knew what? I slammed my phone onto the counter. That email, the one I asked you to send, you never forwarded it. She tilted her head thoughtfully. Oh, that. Oops. That tiny mistake just cost me my promotion. She sighed dramatically. Cassia, you really need to stop blaming other people for your failures. It's getting old. A bitter laugh escaped me before my father's voice cut through the tension. What's going on here? I turned to see Magnus standing in the doorway, already irritated. Cassia's throwing another tantrum, Ophelia said smoothly, leaning against the counter. I swallowed my anger. Dad, I lost my promotion because Ophelia intentionally didn't send the email I asked her to. Magnus frowned, folding his arms. Are you certain it's her fault? Yes, she admitted it. He sighed, shaking his head. Cassia, maybe you're simply not as capable as you think. Later that afternoon, Magnus proudly handed Ophelia a brand new designer handbag, congratulating her on her so-called hard work in school, while she beamed and shot me a triumphant glance. Serafina stood quietly nearby, arms folded, sadness written across her face, but she said nothing. She never did. When I finally laughed in disbelief and pointed out the obvious favoritism, Magnus dismissed me entirely, insisting Ophelia worked harder than I ever had. That evening, Magnus stormed inside furious about a scratch on his car, and without hesitation, Ophelia suggested.
I must have caused it, I protested, insisting I had never even been near the vehicle, but Magnus refused to listen, declaring I would pay for the repairs from my own savings. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at my half-packed suitcase, realizing the truth I had ignored for years. Nothing I did would ever change his opinion. Serafina came to my room quietly, admitting she was trying, but that Magnus would never listen to her. I looked at her, then really looked at her, and saw the quiet resignation in her eyes. She had accepted this life, but I refused to follow the same path. I needed to leave before they took anything else from me. I should have walked away that night. If I had, I wouldn't have been there the next morning when everything finally collapsed. The sound of Magnus shouting echoed through the house, shaking the walls with fury. I rushed to the top of the stairs and saw him standing in the living room, fists clenched, while Serafina looked on anxiously, and Ophelia stood behind him with an unsettling expression that mixed concern with satisfaction. "She stole it," Magnus roared. "My Rolex is missing." My heart dropped immediately. I knew where this was going. Ophelia spoke softly, claiming she had seen me near his office the previous night, and suddenly his anger shifted entirely toward me. "You," he accused. "Do you really think I would steal from you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but Magnus refused to listen, accusing me of betrayal and disrespect, while Ophelia watched the entire scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Finally, Magnus grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight, his voice cold with finality. "You're done here. Get out." Serafina gasped, but he ignored her, throwing the front door open and shouting again, "Get out." I looked toward my mother, waiting for her to fight for me, but she remained silent, her expression filled with an apology she would never say out loud. I turned toward Ophelia and saw her lips form the words, "Good luck, loser." My body felt strangely numb as I walked toward the door, without packing a bag, without taking anything except my phone, my wallet, and the clothes I was wearing. I stepped onto the porch, feeling the cold morning air hit my face, and for the first time in my life, I was completely alone, with nowhere to go. The first night on my own was colder than I had imagined. I wandered the quiet streets of Houston with only $40 in my wallet and my phone battery nearly dead. Eventually, I found a small 24-hour diner on Main Street and stepped inside, hoping for warmth. But when I overheard the staff whispering about asking me to leave if I didn't order food, I quietly walked out before they could confront me. I ended up sitting at a bus stop, hugging my arms around myself, realizing what it truly meant to have nothing. Cars passed occasionally, and distant laughter echoed somewhere down the street, but I had never felt more exposed or more vulnerable in my life. I couldn't stay there long, yet I had nowhere else to go. And then suddenly, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out quickly, the battery barely alive long enough for me to read the message. "Mom, Cassia, where are you? Come home, please." My breath caught. She had reached out. I stared at the words, my emotions a tangled mess of relief, anger, and exhaustion. I wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward, to prove to myself that I didn't need any of them. But I wasn't sure I had the strength to. Before I could decide, the screen went black. My phone had died. I exhaled sharply, pressing my palms into my eyes. I guess I have no choice now. I took a deep breath, turned around, and started walking toward the bus station. I didn't know what to expect when I walked through that door, but I knew things would never be the same again. The house loomed before me, its familiar shape casting long shadows under the dim porch light. My breath fogged in the cold air as I hesitated, fingers tightening around the strap of my backpack. I had walked away from this place with no intention of ever coming back, yet here I was, drawn by a single message from the only person in that house who had ever truly cared. Before I could lift my hand to knock, the door swung open. Serafina stood there, her eyes wide with relief, and something else, something that looked like shame. She looked tired, her hair hastily tied back, dark circles underlining her usually warm gaze. "Come inside, Cassia, please." Her voice was soft, almost pleading.
I hesitated for only a second before stepping past her into the entryway. The familiar scent of the house filled my lungs, lavender and old wood polish, but something felt different. It was too quiet. No distant sounds of the television blaring from the living room, no laughter from Apelia, no commanding voice from Magnus filling the space with authority. Just silence. I swallowed hard. Something was wrong. Serafina led me to the kitchen, motioning for me to sit at the table. The last time I had sat here, I was a child, crying over a scraped knee. Back then, my mother had placed a bandage on my leg, kissed my forehead, and promised me everything would be okay. I wasn't a child anymore, and she couldn't promise me that now. She placed a steaming mug of tea in front of me, sitting down across the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them together. "I should have done something," she said after a moment, her voice thick. "I should have stopped him." I stared at her, emotions whirring inside me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she had fought for me. But had she? Or had she just stood there watching as Magnus threw me out? "You let it happen," I said quietly, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Serafina's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I tried, Cassia. I begged him to reconsider, but he refused to listen." She shook her head, exhaling shakily. "He's too proud, too blind to see what Apelia is doing to you." I studied her face, searching for any sign that this time would be different. "Are you finally ready to stand up to him?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a second, and that second told me everything. A noise from the hallway made me stiffen. Footsteps. I turned as Magnus stepped into the kitchen, his presence immediately filling the space. He was composed, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. Apelia followed closely behind him, her movements as effortless as ever. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded, her lips curled into an almost smile. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," she mused. My fingers curled into fists beneath the table. "I bet you didn't." Magnus's gaze swept over me, impassive. His voice was flat when he spoke. "If you've come back expecting an apology, you won't get one." The words shouldn't have surprised me, but they still felt like a slap. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I didn't come back for you, Magnus," scoffed, shaking his head. "Then why are you here?" The air in the kitchen crackled with tension. I could feel the weight of Apelia's smirk, the smug victory still dancing in her eyes. She thought she had won. Maybe in a way she had. I swallowed hard, refusing to let them see me break. "I came back because Mom asked me to." Magnus exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Serafina, this is ridiculous. You shouldn't have brought her back." Serafina didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, placing herself between me and Magnus. "No, Magnus." Her voice was steady, stronger than I had ever heard it. "She is my daughter, and she is staying here." The room went completely still. Magnus blinked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Apelia's smirk faltered slightly, her confidence shaken by the sudden shift in dynamics. For the first time in years, my mother was standing up for me. I wanted to believe it would last, but I knew this wasn't over yet. The battle lines had been drawn, and Magnus didn't like to lose. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with something unspoken yet undeniable. Magnus took a slow step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over my mother. His expression was dark, eyes narrowed with barely contained fury. "You don't get to make decisions in this house, Serafina," he said, his voice dangerously low. Serafina didn't flinch. She held her ground, her back straight, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. I had never seen her like this before, never seen her fight back. "This is my house, Magnus," she said firmly, "and I say Cassia stays." A silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for the explosion. Magnus's hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw twitching. He had always ruled this house with an iron grip, always had the final say. He wasn't used to being challenged. I could see it in his eyes, the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Apelia was the first to break the silence. "Dad, maybe we should just talk about this." Her voice was smooth, carefully measured. Cassia's obviously upset. I turned to look at her, feeling the anger rise in my chest. Of course she was playing the peacemaker now, pretending to be the reasonable one. But I knew better. This was just another one of her games. Serafina, however, wasn't fooled anymore. "You've done enough, Apelia," she said, her voice sharp. "You and your father have controlled this family for too long." Apelia's expression faltered for the briefest second, just a flicker of something behind her eyes. something that looked an awful lot like fear. "This isn't over, Mom," she whispered. I watched the mask slip, just for a moment. For the first time, Apelia wasn't in control, and she knew it. Then Magnus slammed his hand against the kitchen table. The sound was like a gunshot, shattering the tense silence.
I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. "You don't get to tell me how to run my house," he bellowed, his face red with fury. I felt my pulse spike, adrenaline rushing through my veins. Then his gaze snapped to me, his expression shifting into something darker. "You want to stay?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "Fine, but you follow my rules. One step out of line, and you'll be gone for good." The threat hung in the air between us, suffocating and real. Serafina moved before I could react, stepping between us like a shield. "No, Magnus," she said, her voice steady. "You don't control her anymore." Magnus's nostrils flared, his eyes wild, but something had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't the one calling the shots. I swallowed, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. This was it, the moment everything truly changed. I took a step forward, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You're right, Dad," I said, each word slow and deliberate. "This is your house." His expression flickered with something unreadable. "But it's not my home." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Magnus's face hardened, but he didn't speak. I turned to my mother. "Mom, if you really mean what you said, then prove it." Serafina's breath hitched, her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Then slowly she turned back to Magnus. She met his eyes, her voice calm but unwavering. "I will." The next morning, Mom made an appointment with a divorce lawyer. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her, untouched. Her phone was still in her hand, her fingers hovering just above the screen, as if she were considering undoing whatever she had just done. I hesitated before stepping closer. "Mom?" She looked up at me, her face unreadable. Then with a breath that seemed to release years of held tension, she said, "I made the call. I have an appointment this afternoon." I stared at her, the words taking a second to sink in. "You're serious?" A small humorless laugh escaped her. "I should have done this years ago." I sat down across from her, searching her face for any hesitation, any sign that she was wavering. There was fear in her eyes, but underneath it something stronger, resolve. Magnus had no idea what was coming. The rest of the morning passed in intense silence. Mom kept busy, cleaning, organizing drawers, folding clothes that didn't need folding. I could see it in the way she moved, the restless energy of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the right moment to jump. I didn't say much. What was there to say? Ophelia, however, was watching. She always did. By noon, she finally spoke. "Mom, is something going on?" Serafina barely glanced up from wiping the already clean countertop. "It's nothing you need to worry about." But I saw the way Ophelia's eyes narrowed. She didn't like being kept out of the loop. "Really?" She pressed, her voice laced with suspicion. "Because you've been acting off." Serafina met her gaze, calm and unreadable. "I'm just tired, Ophelia, that's all." For once, Ophelia didn't seem convinced. She lingered in the doorway a second longer before walking away, but I caught the flicker of something behind her carefully constructed mask. Paranoia. She felt it, the shift, and for the first time, she had no idea what was coming next. That evening, the door swung open and Magnus walked in. I was in the living room when I heard it, the slight pause in his footsteps as he crossed the threshold. He knew something was wrong. He set his briefcase down with a little too much force. "What's going on?" Serafina stepped into the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't hesitate. "I have spoken to a lawyer, Magnus. I'm filing for divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like a rubber band snapping, the tension in the room broke. "You're what?" His voice was sharp, disbelieving. Serafina didn't flinch. "I'm leaving you." I held my breath, waiting for the explosion. It came like a storm, sudden and violent. Magnus's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You think you can just throw me away like garbage?" Serafina met his fury with quiet defiance. "This isn't up for debate." I had never seen her like this. Not once. Magnus took a step forward, his body tense. I moved instinctively, stepping between them before I even realized what I was doing. He looked at me, eyes filled with something dangerous. "You think you're strong enough to take me on, Cassia?" His voice was low, menacing, but he wasn't looking at me anymore.
He was looking through me, at her, at Serafina, and she didn't waver. "You'll regret this," he muttered, voice laced with quiet fury. His gaze flickered between the both of us, as if memorizing the moment. Then he turned sharply on his heel and stormed up the stairs. The echo of his footsteps rang through the house. Ophelia stood in the hallway, watching with wide, calculating eyes. The war had begun. We didn't know it yet, but Magnus wasn't going to leave quietly. The air in the living room was thick with tension. Magnus stood in the center, pacing like a caged animal. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with barely contained rage. Serafina stood firm, her arms crossed, her posture unnervingly calm. The storm was brewing right in front of her, yet she didn't flinch. "You don't get to do this," Magnus growled, his voice low and dangerous. Serafina met his glare without hesitation. "I already did." The words were like a slap. I saw the flicker of disbelief in Magnus's eyes, the way his breath hitched just slightly. He was losing control, and he knew it. I had spent my entire life watching my mother yield to him, watching her shrink herself down to avoid his anger. But tonight, something was different. She wasn't afraid anymore, and Magnus didn't know what to do with that. Ophelia stormed into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Her eyes darted between our parents, her breath shallow. "Mom, you can't do this!"
She hissed. Then she turned to Magnus, her voice sharpening. "Dad, do something." For the first time in my life, I saw my father speechless. Ophelia's face twisted in frustration. She whirled on me, her gaze full of venom. "This is your fault." Her voice wavered, but she tried to mask it with fury. "You poisoned her against us." I didn't respond. I just watched, because that's when I saw it. The mask slipping. Ophelia wasn't just angry. She was terrified. She wasn't fighting for Magnus. She was fighting for herself, for the cushioned life she had built under his protection. If he lost, she lost too, and that scared her more than anything. Magnus slammed his fist against the table. The force of it made the whole room jump. "I built this house," he snarled. "I paid for everything, and you think you can just erase me?" His voice shook the walls, but Serafina didn't move. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as he turned toward her, stepping closer. His hands were still shaking, his breathing uneven. I saw something in his eyes then, something dark, something dangerous. Serafina must have seen it too, because she took a slow step back, her expression unchanging. Then she spoke, voice steady as steel. "Touch me, and I'll have you arrested." The words cut through the room like a blade. Magnus froze. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his fingers twitching at his sides. He had spent his whole life wielding power over this house, over her, and now, in this moment, he had none. The realization settled into his expression, twisting his rage into something uglier. "You'll regret this," he spat. "Both of you." Then he turned to Ophelia. "Come on," he ordered. "We're leaving." Ophelia's face paled. She glanced between him and Serafina, hesitating, and then for the first time I saw real doubt in her eyes. She didn't move. Magnus let out a sharp breath, disgust flashing across his face. He turned and grabbed his coat, heading for the door without looking back. He walked out alone. The front door slammed behind him, rattling the walls. And as the silence settled over the house, I knew one thing for sure. He'd be back. And when he returned, he wouldn't be coming to talk. The house felt eerily quiet the next morning. No heavy footsteps echoing down the hall, no sharp commands from the kitchen, no tension humming beneath every conversation. For the first time in years, Magnus was gone. And yet, instead of relief, all I felt was unease. I could see it in my mother, too. Serafina moved around the house as if nothing had happened, tidying up, folding laundry, wiping down counters that were already clean. But her movements were too precise, too methodical, like she was trying to convince herself that this was normal. It wasn't. I sat at the kitchen table, watching her in silence. She wasn't ready to admit it, but I knew the truth. This wasn't over. That afternoon, the first blow came. A knock at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, just a single deliberate rap against the wood. Serafina's hands tensed around the dish towel she had been wringing. I stood up instinctively, something cold settling in my stomach. She walked to the door, hesitated for only a second, and pulled it open. A man in a suit stood on the porch, a folder in his hand. "Mrs. Calloway?" he asked.
Serafina straightened. Yes. He handed her the envelope. You've been served. I heard the sharp inhale of her breath as she took it. The door closed behind her, and she walked back into the kitchen in silence. She set the envelope on the table and slowly opened it. Her face remained unreadable as she skimmed the pages, but I saw her hands tightened just slightly. Then she exhaled. He's contesting the divorce. I swallowed hard. What else? He wants the house, she said simply. I felt my stomach drop. He's trying to ruin you. She nodded, but when she finally looked at me, there was no fear in her eyes, only determination. Then we fight. That night, another knock came. This one was hesitant, uncertain. I glanced at the clock, almost midnight, frowning. I walked to my bedroom door and opened it. Ophelia stood there, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Are you lost? I asked, dryly. She huffed, but didn't rise to the bait. You have to talk to Mom. I raised an eyebrow. I talk to Mom every day, Ophelia. Ophelia let out an impatient breath. Dad is going to destroy us all if she goes through with this. I leaned against the doorframe, folding my arms. Since when do you care? Ophelia's jaw clenched. This isn't about me. I tilted my head, studying her, and then I saw it. The flicker of fear beneath her frustration. This isn't about me, is it? I said slowly. You're just scared of losing everything. She flinched, but didn't deny it. I let out a humorless chuckle. You really thought he'd protect you, didn't you? Ophelia's eyes darkened. You don't understand, Cassia. You've never understood. Then explain it to me, I challenged. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She hesitated for a beat too long, then turned on her heel and walked away. I watched her retreat, the weight of realization pressing down on me. The cracks in her world were starting to show, and she knew it. The phone rang an hour later. Serafina was in the living room, sitting with a book in her lap, though I doubted she had read a single word. When the shrill sound pierced the silence, she didn't even flinch. She reached for the phone, checked the caller ID, and pressed the answer button. Hello, Magnus, she said, her voice cool. I sat on the couch across from her, my pulse spiking. The voice on the other end was low and measured. You think you can win this, Serafina? Serafina's fingers tightened around the phone. This isn't about winning, Magnus. This is about freedom. A slow, cruel laugh filtered through the speaker. You'll never be free of me. My skin crawled at the certainty in his voice. Serafina held the phone to her ear for a moment longer. Then, without another word, she hung up. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I met her gaze. He's not going to stop. She nodded. I know. I exhaled. What do we do now? She set the phone down, her face unreadable. We prepare. As Mom hung up, I knew this fight was far from over. We had underestimated him, and that was our first mistake. The next morning, the doorbell rang, its sharp chimes slicing through the quiet house. I exchanged a glance with Mom before she stood, moving toward the door with careful steps. A man in a crisp suit stood on the porch, holding a thick envelope in his hands. He gave a polite nod before handing it over. Mrs. Calloway, you've been served. Mom didn't react. No flinch, no hesitation. She took the papers and shut the door behind her. I watched as she walked to the kitchen table, her movements slow but deliberate. She unfolded the documents, her eyes scanning the words, her fingers tightening around the pages. Then softly she murmured, He wants to leave us with nothing. I stepped closer. What? Mom exhaled, pressing her lips together before looking up at me. He's contesting everything. He wants the house, the assets, full control of the finances. She turned another page, her expression unreadable.
He's claiming he supported this family financially, that I wouldn't have what I do without him. I felt the heat of anger rise in my chest. That's a lie. You paid for everything, you carried this house, while he... I know her voice was steady, but I saw the way her hands trembled just slightly. I clenched my fists. Then we won't let him. Ophelia stormed into the kitchen an hour later, the papers clutched in her hand like a weapon. Mom, you have to stop this, she snapped, her voice shrill. He's going to ruin us. Mom didn't even glance at her. He's the one doing this, not me. Ophelia's expression twisted, her breathing shallow. You think this is just about you? She waved the documents in frustration. This affects all of us. If he takes the house, he won't. But what if he does? Ophelia's voice wavered. Maybe if we just talk to him. I let out a sharp laugh, cutting her off. Talk to him? Since when has talking to him ever changed anything? Ophelia shot me a glare, but this time there was something beneath it, uncertainty. She was finally realizing she had bet on the wrong side. 2 days later, we sat in the courtroom, waiting for the first hearing to begin. The air was thick with tension, the cold sterility of the room doing nothing to settle my nerves.
I sat beside Mom, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to appear composed. Then the doors opened. Magnus walked in, his suit crisp, his expression composed. A lawyer followed closely behind him, briefcase in hand, his movements precise and confident. Magnus's gaze swept over us, a slow smirk curling at the edges of his lips. He looked like a man who had already won. The hearing began. His lawyer was the first to speak, his voice smooth and practiced. Your Honor, my client has provided for this household for years. His financial contributions ensured the stability of his family, and it is only fair that he be awarded the majority of shared assets, including the home. I felt my nails dig into my palm. Lies. Mom's lawyer didn't even blink before responding. Your Honor, the plaintiff has not contributed financially for years. In fact, Mrs. Calloway was the sole provider of this household, paying the mortgage, utilities, and all household expenses. Any claims to financial contribution are unfounded. Magnus's smirk faltered. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression, something uncertain. For the first time, he wasn't in control. The hearing was brief, just the beginning of what would be a long battle. As we walked out of the courthouse, I could feel his presence behind us, his steps slow and deliberate. And then, just as we reached the exit, he leaned in close to Mom, his voice low. You think you've won, Serafina? He murmured. This is only the beginning. Mom didn't react, didn't even acknowledge him. She just kept walking, her back straight, her face unreadable. But I turned, just enough to meet his gaze, and I saw it. Beneath the anger, beneath the bravado, there was something else. Fear. I had spent my whole life fearing my father, but now, for the first time, I realized he was afraid of us, and that made him more dangerous than ever. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of the lights in the kitchen, the hum of electricity stuttering just for a second, a power outage that lasted only a moment, long enough to make my mother pause, glancing up from her book. Probably just the wiring, she murmured, but I wasn't so sure. Then the bank called. Mom stood at the counter, phone pressed to her ear, her grip tightening as she listened. What do you mean my account was frozen? Her voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of unease. The conversation ended quickly, and when she turned to me, her face was unreadable. Someone tried to put a hold on my accounts, she said. The bank flagged it as fraud. I didn't have to ask who. And then the car appeared, a dark sedan parked just across the street. Not always there, not all night, but enough that I noticed, enough that it sent a chill down my spine. I sat on the couch one evening, staring at it through the window. The engine was running. Someone was inside, but they never got out. He's trying to scare us, I murmured. Mom stood behind me, arms crossed. No, she exhaled. He's trying to break us. Ophelia was quieter than usual. She moved through the house like a ghost. Her usual arrogance faded. I caught her watching Mom more than once, studying her like she was trying to read between the lines of something unspoken. One evening, she slid into the seat across from me at the dining table. We should talk to Dad, she said suddenly. Try to calm him down. I set my fork down, staring at her in disbelief. Are you serious? Ophelia didn't meet my eyes. You're scared, I realized. You think he's going to come after you next. She exhaled, rubbing her hands together, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. For the first time, I saw it. She wasn't just a manipulator. She was a product of him. And now, without his protection, she was just as lost as the rest of us. The pounding on the door woke me in an instant. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. It was nearly 2 a.m. Another loud bang echoed through the house. I threw off my blanket and rushed to my window, peering down. My stomach turned to ice. It was Magnus. Serafina was already in the hallway when I stepped out, her face pale but composed. Don't open it, she whispered. The pounding continued. You think you can take everything from me, Magnus's voice boomed through the door, raw with fury. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow. Then bang, glass shattered somewhere downstairs. Mom flinched, then grabbed her phone, dialing. I'm calling the police. Magnus laughed from outside, a dark, guttural sound. You think they can protect you? I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. This wasn't going to end with words. By the time the police arrived, Magnus was gone. They took our statements, glanced at the shattered window, and nodded solemnly, as Mom filed for a restraining order, but we all knew it wouldn't stop him. Avelia sat on the couch, staring at the shards of glass scattered across the floor, her face unreadable. For the first time, I saw true fear in her eyes. I turned to my mother, my voice quiet but firm. We have to end this before he does, because if we didn't stop him now, we might not get another chance. And Magnus was about to prove exactly how far he was willing to go. The morning after the attack, the house felt different, not just because of the shattered window or the cold breeze that snuck in through the temporary plastic covering it. It was something else, something heavier. Mom stood in the living room, staring at the glass shards still scattered on the floor. She held the phone to her ear, speaking in hushed, clipped tones. I knew who she was talking to. Her lawyer. "We're moving forward with a restraining order," she said, her voice steady, "and I want to discuss the financial dispute." I watched her, noticing how stiff her posture was, how the exhaustion clung to her shoulders. She had always carried so much weight, but for the first time, I could see it wearing her down. "I should have done this years ago," she whispered as she hung up. I swallowed, nodding, but there was a pit in my stomach. "It won't stop him. He won't let us go that easily." She turned to me, her gaze unwavering. "Then we won't make it easy for him either." By noon, another letter arrived. I saw the official-looking envelope before Mom did. My stomach twisted as I picked it up from the mailbox, my fingers tightening around it. The return address was from Magnus's lawyer. Another attack. Mom took the envelope from me, her expression unreadable as she tore it open and unfolded the papers. Her eyes moved across the page, and then, just for a second, I saw it, the flicker of unease. "He's demanding financial compensation," she murmured. I frowned. "What?" "He's claiming he contributed to the home's finances and is entitled to half of everything." My blood boiled. "That's a lie." Mom exhaled through her nose, setting the papers down with deliberate calm. "Of course it is." I watched her closely, noticing how her hands trembled before she balled them into fists. "He's trying to bleed you dry," I said. She lifted her chin. "Let him try." But I knew the truth. This wasn't just about money. This battle wasn't going to end in court. It was about to get personal. Ophelia was pacing when I walked into the kitchen later that evening. The house had been quiet since the letter arrived, but she was anything but. Her arms were folded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mom," she started, hesitant. "Maybe we should settle. Maybe it's not worth it." I stiffened. Mom turned from the sink, giving Ophelia a sharp look. "Are you suggesting we let him win?" Ophelia's mouth opened, then closed. I exhaled slowly, watching her closely. "You're scared," I said. She flinched but didn't deny it. "He's our father, Ophelia." Her voice was quieter now, almost pleading. The air between us grew heavy. For so long I had resented her, hated the way she always took his side, the way she always stood in his shadow. But now I saw it clearly. She wasn't just complicit, she was trapped. But that didn't mean I was going to save her, and I wasn't going to let her drag us down with her. "The lines have been drawn, Ophelia," I said finally. "Pick a side." She didn't answer. Maybe she already had. That night, the final warning came. I had been walking past the front door when something caught my eye, a thin white envelope barely sticking out from beneath the doorframe. I hesitated before reaching for it, dread curling in my gut as I pulled it inside. Inside there was only a single sheet of paper, a note. "You can't hide behind the law forever. I always win." No signature, no thread spelled out, just a message, a promise. I clenched my fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned to Mom, handing her the letter. She read it, her expression unreadable, then set it down. She didn't look afraid, she looked furious. "It's time to end this," I said, voice steady, once and for all. Magnus had declared war, and we were finally ready to fight back. The night before the final hearing, I had a feeling something bad was going to happen. I just didn't know how right I was. The house was quiet, too quiet. Mom was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters for the third time that evening. She wasn't cleaning. She was keeping herself busy, distracting herself from the inevitable. "Tomorrow, it's over," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "One more day, and we're free." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that the judge would see through Magnus's lies, that the restraining order would hold, that the law would finally be on our side. But something inside me wouldn't settle. Magnus wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. I woke up to a sound that didn't belong, a soft creak, barely audible over the hum of the heater. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another sound, closer this time, the stairs. I grabbed my phone, heart hammering, and slid out of bed as quietly as possible. I crept toward my door, inching it open just enough to see the hallway. And then I saw it, a shadow moving through the living room. The front door was still locked. No windows were broken. He had a key. I clenched my jaw, swallowing down the rising panic. Serafina. Door creaked open, and she stepped out, her expression turning to stone the moment she spotted him.
Get out, she said, her voice firm but shaking slightly. Magnus turned toward her, smiling like he had just walked in from work instead of breaking into the house in the middle of the night. You really thought a piece of paper could stop me? He took a slow step forward. You're ruining this family, Serafina. You always were weak. I moved before I could think, stepping between them. You lost this family the moment you chose yourself over all of us, I shot back, my voice steady. Something snapped in his eyes. He lunged, his hand clamped down on my arm, fingers digging into my skin. Pain shot through me, but I refused to let him see it. Then crash! Mom swung a lamp into his shoulder, the sound of shattering glass piercing the air. Magnus stumbled back, his face contorted with shock. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. And then, before he could recover, sirens blew, red and red lights flashed through the windows. I saw the moment he realized it was over. The front door burst open, and officers rushed in. They had barely pulled him away before he turned back, his eyes burning with hatred. You think this is over, he growled. Mom stepped forward, her chin lifted, her voice unwavering. Yes, I do. Magnus's jaw clenched, but this time he had no power left. The officers led him out, his footsteps heavy against the floor. And then silence. I exhaled, my whole body trembling. I turned to Mom. For the first time, our house belonged to us, but the damage he left behind would take longer to fix. The next morning, we stood in court for the final time, this time without fear. The air inside the courthouse was sterile, the walls a dull shade of beige, but for the first time, I didn't feel suffocated by them. This place had been a battleground for months, a place where Magnus had tried to manipulate, control, and destroy us. But today, we weren't the ones on trial. I glanced at my mother. She sat beside me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no shaking, no hesitation, just quiet strength. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Magnus was led inside, his hands cuffed in front of him. His once pristine suit was wrinkled, his face unshaven. The arrogance that had always radiated from him was gone, replaced with something else, defeat. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the court has reached its final decision. I held my breath. Full ownership of the property and financial assets is awarded to Serafina Calloway. Relief crashed over me like a wave. The divorce is officially granted, with no financial obligations to the defendant. Mom exhaled slowly. And given Mr. Calloway's repeated violations of the restraining order, combined with his recent acts of violence, this court is issuing a formal sentence which will be carried out immediately. I looked at Magnus, expecting him to fight, to protest, to do what he always did, make himself the victim. But he just sat there, staring ahead. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and cool. The weight I had carried for years had finally started to lift. I was about to head toward the car when I heard my name. Cassia, wait. I turned, already knowing who it was. Ophelia. She stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. I need to talk to you. I crossed my arms. Why? Ophelia swallowed, shifting her weight from foot to foot. I didn't know he'd go this far, she said quietly. I thought he was just trying to scare you. I let out a humorless laugh. You thought he was scaring us for fun? She winced. She hesitated. I don't want to lose my family. Something in me tensed, waiting for the anger, the resentment, the years of pain to surge forward. But I felt nothing. You already did, Ophelia. Lips parted, but no words came. She knew it was true. For once in her life, she had to face the consequences. I turned away, walking toward the car without looking back. The house felt different when we stepped inside, lighter. I stood in the middle of the living room, taking it all in. The same walls, the same furniture, the same space that had once felt like a cave. But now, for the first time, it felt like something else. Ours. Mom handed me a cup of coffee, sitting beside me on the couch. So, I murmured, staring at the quiet, sunlit room. What now? She smiled, a small, tired, but real smile. Now, she said, we live. For the first time in my life, home wasn't a prison. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. Ours. But even as we tried to move forward, the ghosts of the past weren't ready to let us go. The house was quiet. Too quiet. A week had passed since the court ruling, since Magnus had been taken away, since the war had officially ended, and yet every time the floor creaked,
or the wind pushed against the windows, my body tensed, waiting for something that wasn't coming. Mom and I fell into a new routine. Morning coffee in the kitchen, the absence of whispered arguments behind closed doors, the relief of knowing that no one was lurking just around the corner, waiting to strike. It should have been peaceful. It should have been freeing. But instead, it felt empty. Mom caught me flinching one evening when a car door slammed outside. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me with quiet understanding. "It's going to take time," she finally murmured. I nodded, but deep down I wasn't sure if time would ever be enough. The knock on the door came on a Thursday afternoon. I almost didn't answer it, but something in me knew. When I pulled the door open, Ophelia stood there. She looked different, not the perfectly polished, immaculately composed version of herself I had grown up with. She looked small, tired. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally she said, "I don't have anywhere else to go." I exhaled, 1,000 responses flashing through my mind. "And what do you expect me to do about that? And that's my problem, how? And you had a place, you chose to burn it down?" But instead, all I said was, "Why are you here, Ophelia?"
She swallowed hard, shifting on her feet. "I don't know. I don't know who I am without him." Her voice cracked on the last word. Magnus, she wasn't here for redemption. She wasn't here to undo the past. She was here because, for the first time in her life, she had no one to hide behind. I didn't invite her in right away. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her like I had never really looked at her before. "I'm not going to forget what you did," I said finally, "and I don't know if I'll ever forgive you." She nodded, the weight of those words settling in. "I don't deserve it anyway," she murmured. Silence stretched between us. Two sisters who were never really sisters. After a long pause, I pushed the door open just enough to let her step inside. Not because I trusted her, not because things would ever be okay between us, but because, for the first time, she wasn't pretending. Maybe this wasn't an ending. Maybe it was just the in-between. No matter how much we tried to outrun it, the past would always be a part of us. A month had passed since the courtroom, since Magnus had been taken away, since we had finally won. Life without him was different. There was space now, a quietness in the house that hadn't existed before. The air felt lighter, as if we had been holding our breath for years, and only now we were allowed to exhale. Mom filled the silence in small ways. She repainted the kitchen, rearranged the furniture, started attending yoga classes at the community center. I watched as she slowly rediscovered herself, piece by piece, reclaiming the life that had always been hers. I threw myself into work, no longer carrying the weight of my father's judgment every time I stepped into my office. For the first time, my life was my own, but the scars remained. I still tensed when I heard an unexpected noise in the house. Mom still hesitated before answering an unknown number. Some nights I lay awake, replaying his last words in my head. "You think this is over?" I knew better than to think trauma had an expiration date. One evening, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, I finally voiced the thought that had been haunting me. "It doesn't just go away, does it, Mom?" Mom sighed, staring out at the dimming sky. "No," she added, "but it gets quieter." Ophelia had been staying with us for a few days, but we all knew it wasn't permanent. She didn't belong here anymore. I saw it in the way she hesitated before entering a room, the way she avoided real conversations, the way she glanced toward the front door as if debating whether to walk through it for good. One evening, she finally said it. "I think I'm going to leave town." I looked up from my book, raising an eyebrow. "Running away?" She shrugged, starting over. I searched her face, looking for something: remorse, regret, even the slightest hint of self-awareness. But there was nothing, just exhaustion. And for the first time in my life, I felt no anger toward her, no bitterness, just acceptance. "Do whatever you want, Ophelia," I said, closing my book. "But don't expect me to save you next time." She nodded, as if she already knew that. The next morning, she was gone. No goodbyes, no long explanations, just a quiet exit. And honestly, that was probably the way it was always meant to be. I stepped onto the porch that afternoon, looking at the house that had once felt like my prison. The walls were the same, the doors, the windows, the floors. They were all still there.
But it felt different now. Lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, it could be something else. Mom joined me, coffee in hand, her expression calm. "So what now?" I asked. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "Now we build something new." I nodded. For the first time, I believed that was possible. We weren't healed yet, but we were free. And maybe that was enough for now. Life doesn't always give us the closure we want. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to live with the scars. I spent years believing I was powerless, trapped in a home that never felt like mine. But the truth is, freedom isn't given. It's taken. We don't heal overnight. The past lingers. The pain echoes. But we move forward anyway. Because strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing up every time we do. If this story spoke to you, if you believe in resilience, in reclaiming your voice, then stay. There's more to share, more to heal, more to grow. Subscribe, and let's walk this journey together.